The Grand Conclave Chamber on orbital station Ethan Prime was the largest room humanity had ever been invited into. A vast circular hall with walls that shimmered like the inside of a living thing, where the seats of 412 alien civilizations rose in curved tiers toward a ceiling lost in artificial starlight. Admiral Ambassador Sarah Voss walked into that chamber with her chin level and her shoulders straight, the way her father had taught her to walk into any room where someone wanted her to feel small. She was human, after all, and humans had long practice with that particular feeling. The year was 2387, and humanity had held its seat on the Galactic Council for 60 years, a fact the other species found either amusing or irrelevant, depending on which one you asked. The 60 years was nothing to civilizations that had been sailing the stars for 4,000. The Vrethkai, a towering insectoid species whose compound eyes never seemed to blink, had been members of the Council before humanity had invented writing. The Selen Collective, beings of crystalline light who communicated through vibration and color, had mapped the galaxy before humans had learned to farm. And the Duran hegemony, massive, are slow-moving reptilians with lifespans measured in centuries, regarded every younger species the way an ancient mountain regards new weather. Sarah took her seat at the curved end of the lowest tier, the human seat, the seat that had been diplomatically positioned as far from the center podium as the geometry of the room allowed. She set her datapad on the table and folded her hands and waited. A High Arbiter Zekthal of the Vrethkai opened the 412th Grand Conclave with the customary Declaration of Unity. A speech that sounded like it meant something but never quite committed to anything specific. His mandibles clicked rhythmically as he spoke through the translation matrix, and his compound eyes swept the room with the air of someone who already knew every outcome of every vote before anyone cast one. The first hour was routine. Resource disputes between the Duran and a smaller species called the Fenari, a trade agreement between two Outer Rim civilizations that nobody at the important seats cared much about. Then the tone of the chamber changed. A Vrethkai technician stepped to the center podium and activated the holographic display, and the room went quiet in a way that had nothing to do with politeness. The display showed the outer rim of the galaxy, a region of sparse stars and ancient dark matter clouds, and moving through it was something that made every heart in that room, regardless of how many chambers it had or what fluid it pumped, beat a little faster. The Void Harvesters. They were a machine civilization, or more precisely, a machine process. Nobody had created them with intention. They had simply emerged somewhere in the dark between galaxies and begun doing what their programming, written by no one, demanded, harvesting all organic matter and converting it into more of themselves. They had destroyed 4 civilizations in the Outer Rim already, 4 civilizations that the Council had meant to send aid to, but had never quite gotten around to. Now they were closer. The debate that followed was long and loud and filled with the particular kind of noise that powerful beings make when they are frightened but refuse to admit it. Every major species pledged their fleets. Every major species outlined their battle doctrines. Every major species spoke with great confidence about how their tactics would surely be the ones that mattered most. Then Sarah Voss stood up. She did not wait to be acknowledged. Humans rarely did, which the other species found either charming or infuriating. And she spoke in a clear, calm voice that the translation matrix carried to every seat in the chamber. "The human fleet is ready to deploy to the Outer Rim," she said, "and we are requesting assignment to the forward combat line." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds, and then the chamber filled with a sound that the translation matrix rendered, somewhat inadequately, as laughter. It came from the Vrethkai section first, that rapid clicking of mandibles that served as amusement among their kind. Then it spread, softer and more restrained, through the Duran seats, where several elder members leaned toward each other with expressions that were not quite smiles but were definitely not respect. High Arbiter Zekthal rose from his seat with the deliberate slowness of someone who wants the room to watch him do it. "The human delegation's enthusiasm is noted," he said, in the tone of a teacher addressing a child who has said something technically incorrect but emotionally understandable. "However, the Council must consider the practical realities. Humanity has been a spacefaring civilization for less than 4 centuries, and a Council member for less than 1. Your fleet numbers are modest. Your combat record in interstellar engagements is limited, and your species, if we are being candid, is known across the galaxy primarily for its— He paused, letting the pause do its work. Emotional volatility. More clicking from the Vrethkai seats. Another senior member of the council, or a Solen delegate whose crystalline body pulsed with colors Sarah had learned to read as condescension, rose to second the sentiment. The human forces, the delegate suggested in shimmering violet and pale amber, would be far better utilized in supply chain management and morale support roles, far from the actual fighting, where the serious civilizations would be working. Sarah Voss sat down slowly. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not do the thing that every Vrethkai in the room was quietly hoping she would do, which was lose her composure and prove their point about emotional volatility. She simply picked up her datapad, made a note in it, and nodded once. The small, precise nod of someone who has just been handed useful information. Because here was the thing about Sarah Voss, and about humans in general, not that the Council had not yet learned to recognize as dangerous. Humans did not need to be given the important jobs to do important things. They had a long and complicated history of being underestimated, under-resourced, and dismissed, and an equally long history of making that into an advantage. As the session closed and the delegates filed out, Scale Commander Urath of the Duran Hegemony passed near the human section and glanced at the ambassador. She was already deep in conversation with two of her aides, pointing at something on her datapad with the focused energy of someone who was not thinking about the insult they had just received, but about what they were going to do next. Urath watched her for a moment longer than he intended to. Then he walked away and made a private note of his own. Something he could not quite explain yet, but which felt, in his long and carefully considered experience, or like the early signs of a very significant miscalculation. 6 months after the 412th Grand Conclave, the Kepler corridor looked nothing like the peaceful stretch of sparse stars it had been on every navigation chart humanity owned. The outer rim had become a war zone, not the clean, organized kind that appeared in Vrethkai military textbooks, but the ugly, grinding, resource-burning kind that nobody ever put in a textbook because it was too complicated to reduce to diagrams. And the void harvesters moved in enormous swarms, each unit no larger than a ground vehicle, but capable of joining with thousands of others to form structures that could crack a moon. They did not negotiate. They did not communicate. They did not retreat unless the mathematics of survival demanded it. They simply came forward, disassembled whatever organic matter they encountered, and converted it into more of themselves. The Vrethkai fleet, deployed in their famous Delta Wing formations, a tactic they had refined over 3,000 years of interstellar warfare, had engaged 2 harvester swarms in the first month and lost roughly a third of their advanced ships. The Solen Collective had fared slightly better, but not in any way that felt like comfort. The Duran Hegemony was still moving its fleets into position, because Duran fleets moved with the patience of beings who measured time in centuries and had never found urgency to be particularly productive. And then there were the humans. Commander Dax Orell was not, by most conventional measures, the kind of person you built a war around. He was 34 years old, which in human terms was young, and in Vrethkai terms was practically an infant. He had a habit of eating while working, a tendency to speak before he had finished thinking, and an absolute disregard for the chain of command when he felt the chain of command was being slow about something important. He was also, without any close competition, the most dangerous engineer in the Kepler corridor. His assignment was officially forward logistics support, which meant his 3 ships were supposed to be hauling fuel cells and medical supplies between the rear depots and the main battle lines. But Dax Orell had a problem with the word supposed, particularly when there was a more interesting option available. On the 3rd day of his deployment, his crew recovered a damaged Void Harvester drone that had drifted into their patrol lane, one of the smaller scout units about the size of a human fist, its outer casing cracked and its primary functions offline. A sensible logistics officer would have cataloged it and forwarded it to the Vrethkai Research Division, who had been studying captured units for months with no significant results. Dax Orell brought it to his workshop and took it apart. He did not sleep for 2 days. His crew brought him food that he did not eat, and coffee that he did drink, and updates that he responded to with one-word answers that technically qualified as communication, but did not invite further conversation. On the third day, he called his crew into the workshop and pointed at the disassembled drone laid out on his workbench. "It thinks in patterns," he said, "and the patterns repeat. Not exactly, but close enough that if you introduce a signal at this frequency." He pointed at a component that looked like 3 rings of dark metal nested inside each other. "The whole unit enters a feedback loop and loses its connection to the swarm." His chief engineer, a young woman named Petra who had been studying xenomechanics since she was 16, looked at the component and then at Dax and then back at the component. "How did the Vrethkai Research Division miss that?" she asked. "They didn't take it apart," Dax said, as if that explained everything, which to him it did. Within 3 weeks, human engineers across the Kepler corridor were testing variations of Dax's signal disruptor. Within 6 weeks, they had a version that worked consistently. Within 8 weeks, they had a version that could be broadcast from a ship's communication array and affect every drone within a 2-kilometer radius. The Vrethkai Research Division, upon receiving the human report, reviewed it for 4 days and then sent back a response that the translation matrix rendered as, "This is improbable, but we will test it," which was, for the Vrethkai, practically a standing ovation. Oh, but the signal disruptor was not the only thing happening in the human section of the Kepler corridor. Human doctors were running open medical bays that treated wounded soldiers from every species in the conflict. A logistical kindness that nobody had asked for, but that quickly became essential, because the Vrethkai medical system was organized around Vrethkai biology and did not adapt well to the 17 other body types currently getting themselves injured in the fight. Or a human doctor named Calloway had become something of a legend among the Duran wounded after successfully treating a scale commander's crushed ventral casing using tools designed for human surgery and a degree of improvisation that the patient had described, upon recovery, as alarming but effective. And there were the human diplomats, quiet, persistent, slightly annoying people who kept showing up in the corridors between species command sections with food and conversation and an endless supply of patient goodwill. It was the diplomats who noticed what nobody else had time to notice. The Vrethkai and the Selen Collective had stopped sharing battle intelligence with each other. Or there had been some diplomatic incident 3 weeks earlier, something about a resource claim in the Outer Rim that predated the current crisis. And now, 2 of the most important fleets in the defense effort were operating on separate information. A human diplomat named Torres spent 11 days having quiet conversations with both sides. She did not demand meetings. She did not issue formal requests through the council protocol system. She simply talked to people, listened carefully, and found the specific misunderstanding at the center of the dispute, a translation error in a 40-year-old treaty that both sides had been interpreting differently. On the 12th day, Vrethkai and Solen battle intelligence was flowing freely again. Scale Commander Urath, recovered from an earlier injury and back on active duty, had been watching all of this with growing attention. He had begun sending reports to the Duran High Command. Careful, detailed reports about human behavior under pressure. The reports were not dramatic. They were simply observational. "They do not wait for permission to solve a problem," he wrote in one dispatch. "They assess the problem, determine the fastest available path to a solution, and begin working before the authorization process has been initiated." This creates a kind of momentum that is difficult to model using conventional military planning frameworks. His superiors read the reports and filed them under interesting, low priority. Urath disagreed with that classification, but he was patient. He was Duran, and patience was the thing his species did better than anyone. He continued to watch and to write and to wait for the moment when everyone else would understand what he had already begun to suspect. The humans were not here to support the war. They were here to win it. The attack on Kepler Station began without warning at 0347 station time, which meant that most of the alien crews were in whatever passed for sleep among their respective species, and the duty officers were running on reduced staffing and the particular kind of tired that comes from 3 months of sustained combat operations. The Void Harvesters came from 4 directions simultaneously. This was new. Every engagement up to that point had seen the Harvesters approach in a single mass. The swarm mentality, the documentation called it. The tendency to consolidate force rather than distribute it. The Vrethkai tactical computers had modeled thousands of possible Harvester attack scenarios, and in every single one, the swarm came together before it struck. Nobody had modeled this. The four attack columns were each roughly equivalent in size to anything the harvesters had deployed before. But together, they were something different. They hit the outer defense perimeter from north, south, east, and west simultaneously, and the Vrethkai ships that had been positioned to repel a concentrated assault suddenly found themselves trying to defend four fronts with a force designed for one. The Vrethkai formation held for 11 minutes, which was longer than anyone had a right to expect, and a testament to how good Vrethkai discipline was even in complete surprise. And then it shattered. The Solen Collective's response wing scrambled within seconds of the first impact, but then something worse happened. The harvesters had deployed a new jamming signal that operated on a frequency eerily close to the Solen communication band. It did not eliminate Solen communication entirely, but it fractured it, introducing delays and distortions into a hive mind that depended on perfect synchronization. Solen soldiers began to freeze mid-action, waiting for commands that were arriving corrupted or not at all. Within 8 minutes, 3 Solen wings had effectively stopped functioning as combat units. Kepler Station's commander, a Vrethkai officer named Battlemaster Reth, sent out a fleet-wide emergency signal and began running scenarios on his tactical display. Every scenario ended the same way. At current rates of engagement, the outer defense ring would collapse in 30 minutes, the inner ring in 45, and Kepler Station itself, home to 40,000 personnel from 60 species, would be harvested in approximately 1 hour. He sent the emergency signal again and added the words that no commander in the Galactic Council had ever sent before. All available forces, including human contingent, are authorized for full combat engagement. The human contingent received the signal 11 seconds after it was sent. Admiral Sarah Voss was already awake. She had learned to sleep lightly in the Kepler corridor, because in her experience the interesting things tended to happen at inconvenient hours. And she was at her command station within 30 seconds of the alert. She looked at the tactical display for exactly 45 seconds, her face completely still. Then she opened a channel to her fleet captains. "This is Voss," she said. "I want the fleet split into 14 independent strike groups. Each group takes full autonomous engagement authority, full discretion on tactics, no orders required from Central Command after initial deployment. You all know what we are here to do. Go do it." Her operations officer, a careful man named Hendricks, who had graduated top of his class at the Naval Academy and believed deeply in protocol, turned from his station with an expression that was trying to be professional and not entirely succeeding. 14 independent groups with no central command?" he asked. "Admiral, that is not a formation. That is just—" "It is what we are doing," Sarah said, pleasantly. The human fleet moved. Yet what happened over the next 22 minutes was something that battle analysts would study for decades. Not because it was clean or elegant, because it was neither. It was chaotic. It was improvised. Individual ship captains made decisions that no tactical model would have recommended. And those decisions worked because no tactical model had predicted them, which meant the harvesters' coordination systems had not predicted them either. One human captain drove her ship directly through a harvester swarm at high speed with shields at maximum. Not trying to destroy the swarm, but trying to scatter it, to break the geometric efficiency of the machine's coordinated attack. And it worked because no machine logic had accounted for the possibility that an organic being would willingly charge into 10,000 drones with no plan except to cause confusion. Another captain used his ship's engine wash as a weapon. Flying low and hot along the outer hull of the station and burning a harvester cluster that had begun the process of attaching to the station's power grid. 3 human ships formed an impromptu relay, catching Solen soldiers as their transport was shredded and transferring them to a human vessel at speeds that the docking protocol manual did not technically permit. And Dax Oral, running his signal disruptor at full broadcast power from a ship that had been designed for logistics and was not remotely rated for combat, flew directly into the center of the largest harvester column and began transmitting. The effect was not instant. It never was. But it began within seconds. Drones at the edges of the column began losing synchronization with the swarm. The perfect, terrible geometry of the harvester formation started to develop gaps. Individual units slowed, stopped, reversed, and bumped into each other with the aimless confusion of machines that had lost the signal, telling them what they were supposed to be. The column fragmented. The Vrethkai forces, regrouping at the edges of the battle, saw the fragmentation and understood something was happening even if they did not yet understand what. Battlemaster Reth, trained since childhood to recognize a turning point, he committed his remaining reserve forces to the gap and drove through it. The other three Harvester columns, their coordination suddenly degraded by the signal disruption spreading through their shared frequencies, began to pull back. At 0512 station time, 1 hour and 25 minutes after the first impact, the Void Harvester assault on Kepler Station was over. The battle replay was transmitted to the full Galactic Council within the hour, and for a long time after the transmission ended, the council chambers were very quiet. High Arbiter Zekthal watched the replay 3 times, his compound eyes unblinking, his mandibles perfectly still, which, among the Vrethkai, was the expression of someone doing a great deal of thinking and none of it comfortable. What the replay showed was not a heroic last stand or a glorious charge. It was messier than that, more improvised, more human. It showed beings making decisions that should not have worked, working together in ways that no alliance protocol had established, risking their own lives for species they barely knew in a battle they had not been invited to fight. And winning. Sarah Voss did not watch the replay. She was in the medical bay, moving from bed to bed among her wounded, in saying their names and holding their hands and being present in the way that humans are present with each other when the cost of something has been very real. The medical bays of Kepler Station after the battle were quiet in the way that only places of recovery can be. A deep, careful quiet that held both relief and grief at the same time, that asked nothing of the people within it, except that they rest and heal and begin the slow work of continuing. 2000. 312 human soldiers had died in the defense of Kepler Station. They had died in the cold of space on the hull of a station that was not theirs, fighting for a cause that the galaxy had not seen fit to include them in until there was no other choice. Their names were on a list that Sarah Voss had read through twice in the hour after the battle ended, and she would read it through many more times in the weeks ahead. Not as a formality, but because she believed, in the particular stubborn way that humans believe things, that the dead deserved to be known. The human custom of remembrance was not something the other species had seen up close before. There was a ceremony on the 3rd day after the battle. Nothing official, nothing that appeared on the Council's event schedule. It was simply human soldiers gathering in Kepler Station's largest open bay, or standing together in the particular formation of people who have lost someone and need to be near other people who understand what that feels like. They spoke names aloud, all 2,312 of them. And between the names there was silence, and the silence was not empty but full of everything that could not be said. Representatives from other species wandered in, uncertain of the protocol, standing at the edges of the gathering and watching. A group of young Vrethkai soldiers stood near the entrance, their mandibles still, their compound eyes moving slowly across the assembled humans, with an expression that their own cultural vocabulary did not have a precise word for, but which was something in the direction of reverence. They had never seen grief performed this way, not as weakness, not as spectacle, but as a deliberate act of witness, a refusal to let loss become abstraction. For one of them quietly asked a human soldier standing near the door what the ceremony was called. "We just call it saying their names," the soldier said. The Vrethkai soldier thought about this for a long time and then nodded. Once in a way that meant something. Scale Commander Urath had been in the human medical bay since 2 days after the battle, not as a patient this time, but as a visitor. He had come initially to deliver a formal message of gratitude from the Duran High Command, which he had delivered correctly and with appropriate diplomatic precision. And then, instead of leaving, he had stayed. He had watched human doctors and nurses move through the ward with a speed and focus that was somehow simultaneously efficient and personal. They knew their patients' names, knew which ones had family, knew which ones preferred silence and which ones needed to talk. A Duran soldier in the far bed had taken a structural impact to his ventral casing and was in the slow, yet difficult Duran process of recovery, which in human medical terms looked uncomfortably like paralysis, but was actually a controlled shutdown of non-essential systems that could last weeks. On the fourth day, Ureth was sitting near the Duran soldier's bed. A quiet companionship, the way Duran showed solidarity, when a human nurse named Marisol stopped by on her rounds. Yet the Duran soldier's vitals were stable, but his eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling with the particular blankness of a being who is far from home and in pain and without the comfort of his own kind nearby. Marisol looked at him for a moment. Just a moment of reading his face, the way humans read faces, gathering information from expressions that required no translation. And then, without any explanation or preamble, she sat in the chair beside his bed and began to sing. It was a soft song, something old, something that had no meaning in any Duran cultural context, a human lullaby from a language that predated space travel, carrying a melody that spoke of nothing more complicated than rest and safety and the quiet promise that morning would come. The Duran soldier could not have understood a single word of it. His eyes moved from the ceiling to Marisol's face. His breathing slowed. After a few minutes, his eyes closed. Anurath sat very still and watched this happen, and felt something shift inside him. Something that his 400 years of life had not previously prepared him for. He was not an emotional being by Duran standards, which meant he was not an emotional being by almost any standard in the galaxy. But in that moment, in that plain and practical medical bay with its smell of antiseptic and its sounds of quiet machinery, he understood something about humanity that all of his careful reports had been circling around without quite reaching. They did not separate caring from strength. They did not treat kindness as a thing you could afford only when the danger was over. They carried both at the same time, as naturally as breathing. The willingness to fight with everything they had, and the willingness to sit beside a stranger and sing until the stranger was no longer afraid. Or he left the medical bay and went directly to his communication station and wrote the longest dispatch of his career. "We have been measuring humanity by the wrong instruments," he wrote. "We looked at the length of their history and found it short. We looked at the size of their fleet and found it modest. When we looked at the record of their civilization and found it marked by conflict and error and the kind of failures that older species have learned to present as ancient history rather than recent character. We decided from all of this that they were small. We were wrong. Not about the facts, but about what the facts meant. A species that has survived its own worst instincts, that has pulled itself forward through centuries of its own violence and come out the other side still capable of sitting beside a stranger and singing. That is not a small species. That is a species that has earned something that cannot be measured by fleet numbers or years of membership. We have been fools, and I say this as a Duran, which means I say it with the full understanding of how rarely we admit error and how seriously I mean it." The dispatch was marked urgent and sent to the Duran High Command within the hour. Meanwhile, Sarah Voss had received a formal summons from the Galactic Council. A closed session, no press, no public record. The kind of meeting that happens when powerful people want to discuss something without consequence. She prepared for it the way she prepared for everything. She read everything she could find, she talked to her team, she slept 8 hours, and she walked in with her chin level and her shoulders straight and no particular interest in being impressive. The Council expected demands. They expected leverage, requests for expanded fleet authority, petitions for resources, the normal vocabulary of political power. Yet they had just watched humanity save 40,000 lives in a battle that the rest of them had been losing, and they understood that this created a dynamic that humanity was now positioned to exploit. Sarah Voss set a single document on the table in front of them. It was a reconstruction plan, detailed, costed, fully operational, for every species that had taken significant losses in the defense of Kepler Station. It covered shipyard access, medical supply chains, crew support programs, and long-term recovery frameworks. It had clearly taken weeks of work to prepare, which meant it had been prepared before the battle, which meant someone had been planning for the aftermath of a victory that humanity had not officially been allowed to fight for. "This is what we are offering," Sarah said, "and what we are asking for is one thing." She looked around the chamber at the most powerful beings in the known galaxy. "Treat us as equals." A year after the Battle of Kepler Station, the Galactic Council convened for the 413th Grand Conclave, and the chamber on orbital station Ethan Prime looked different from how it had looked 12 months before, though nothing about its physical structure had changed. The walls were the same shifting glass, the seats were the same curved tiers rising toward the same distant ceiling, and the translation matrix hummed at the same frequency it always had. What was different was harder to see and more important. The Duran delegates arrived early, which was unprecedented as Duran never arrived early to anything, and took their seats without the usual extended ceremony of status signaling that preceded Duran participation in any formal gathering. Scale Commander Urath, elevated since Kepler Station to a position on the Duran High Command, he sat at the delegation table and watched the room fill with the quiet attention of someone who has been watching carefully for a long time and is about to see whether his observations were correct. The Vrethkai delegation filed in with their customary precise formation, mandibles clicking in the low register that indicated formal engagement. High Arbiter Zekthal took his seat at the center of the Vrethkai section and placed his hands flat on the table in front of him. A gesture that in Vrethkai body language indicated a being was about to do something that required intention, something they had thought about carefully and arrived at through effort rather than instinct. The Solen collective pulsed with colors that the translation matrix did its best to convert into meaning. Something between anticipation and resolve, the chromatic equivalent of a deep breath before important words. And then the human delegation entered, and something happened in the chamber that had never happened at a grand conclave in 412 previous sessions. The room applauded, not all at once, and not with the synchronized precision of a planned tribute. It began with the Duran section, a low rhythmic striking of broad hands against the table that built in volume until it filled that section, and then spread to the smaller civilizations in the mid-tier seats, then climbed to the upper galleries where the observer species watched, and then, last and loudest, the Vrethkai began their clicking, faster and higher than their usual register, a sound that every other species in the room recognized as Vrethkai approval, even if they had never heard it at that volume before. Sarah Voss walked to the human's seat, the same seat at the same curved end of the lowest tier, and sat down. And her face was composed and serious, and only someone who knew her well would have noticed that her hands, folded on the table, were holding each other slightly tighter than usual. The formal business of the conclave began, and the first item on the agenda was not a trade dispute or a resource claim or any of the normal vocabulary of interstellar politics. High Arbiter Zekthal stood, and the chamber went quiet with a speed that indicated the room had been waiting for this moment. The Vrethkai Empire moves to formally propose the elevation of humanity to founding tier status within the Galactic Council, he said, his voice carrying through the translation matrix in its characteristic flat precision, with all rights, responsibilities, and standing equal to the oldest members of this body, effective immediately, pending vote. There was a second motion, then a third, then a fourth from other delegations before the first had finished being recorded. The Duran, the Fenari, two outer rim civilizations that humanity had never had significant diplomatic contact with, all seconding, all adding their voices to the record. The vote was unanimous. It was the first unanimous vote in 413 grand conclaves. The council records would note this fact, and historians would spend considerable time trying to explain what it meant about the moment and the civilization it recognized. And most of them would eventually conclude that the simplest explanation was the correct one. For the first time in a very long time, every member of the Galactic Council agreed on something because every member of the Galactic Council genuinely meant it. Sarah Voss was given the floor. She stood and looked at the chamber, at the 412 civilizations represented in those rising tiers, at the walls that were currently the warm amber of something close to welcome, at the Vrethkai Arbiter who had laughed at her 12 months ago and was now watching her with eyes that held something genuine. And she took a slow breath and spoke. "Humanity is grateful," she said, "and humanity is honored, and humanity is going to be honest with you, which is something you should get used to because it is one of the things we do that is occasionally inconvenient." A murmur moved through the chamber. Not laughter exactly, but close to it, and warmer. We are not a perfect species," she continued. "We are not an old species, and we are not a species without a history of serious mistakes. Our own history includes centuries of war with ourselves, and exploitation, and the kind of failures that we do not get to put far enough in the past to stop being responsible for them. We carry that. We think it is important to carry it, Some because a species that has forgotten what it costs to become something better is a species that has not actually become something better. She looked at Zekthal directly. We did not save Kepler Station because we are more powerful than any of you. We saved it because we were given nothing to lose and a problem to solve. And that is a combination that humanity has had a great deal of practice with. What we are offering this council is not protection. We are not your protectors. While what we are offering is partnership, real partnership, the kind where we tell you when we think you are wrong, and we expect the same in return, and we work on the hard things together without waiting for someone else to decide it is time. The chamber was very still. The Void Harvesters are still out there, she said, and they will come again. Not in months, probably, but in years. And they will be different from the last time because that is what they do, they adapt. And when they come again, we will need to be ready together in ways that we are not yet ready. And that is what I am asking this council to spend the next year working on. She sat down. The applause that followed was not ceremonial. It was the irregular, genuine sound of beings who had heard something true and needed to say so. Out in orbit above the station, Dax Oral was on the hull of his ship running a maintenance check that he had been meaning to get to for 3 weeks. He had watched the conclave feed on a small screen mounted inside his helmet, and when the unanimous vote was announced, he had stopped working for about 30 seconds and looked at the stars. The stars did not look different. They never did. But Dax had a habit, inherited from his grandmother who had grown up somewhere on Earth where the sky was dark enough to see them clearly, of treating stars as something to be reckoned with, as a reminder that the universe was enormous and did not particularly care about the things happening inside it, and that this made the things happening inside it more important, not less. He picked up his tool and went back to work. The harvesters were still out there. The signal disruptor needed 3 upgrades before the next engagement season. He had 17 ideas for how the fleet coordination system could be improved and had only written up 4 of them. The universe was enormous and it did not particularly care. Dax Orel cared quite a lot, and he had work to do,